as well. So thank you so much for participating in this interview. This is part of an educational research project to explore the impact of patient suicide on trainees and supervisors. And I really appreciate you taking the time to speak to me about your experience. So can you tell me a little about your training in the program so far? Like, where you at? What's it like working with patients and attendings?
So where I'm at right now. So right now I'm doing my CL fellowship. And so I mean, it's been an interesting year. I'm about 7 months in, 7 or 8 months in. And it's been an interesting year of working directly with attendings, but also throughout the year I've been getting more autonomy. Been seeing patients in a lot of different settings. I am the burn trauma fellow. So I see a lot of patients, either from the burn service or the trauma service who are coming in, to the hospital for several various different reasons.
And then when you had the experience of this patient's death, and by suicide, can you tell me what year you were in and what was your relationship with your colleagues and attendings at the time?
Sure. So I was actually an intern, and it was within my first month of psychiatry that I had taken care of this patient. And then we had found out maybe 2 weeks after she had committed suicide. So I was brand new to the department, and had really supportive attendings at the time. But I had also switched off of service. So it was an interesting situation for me, because the attending that I was directly working with wasn't the attending that I was seeing, wasn't the attending on the team when I was seeing the patient. So I was also the first person in my class for this to happen to. So I wasn't quite sure how to, what I was supposed to do and how to approach it.
And so what was your role in the care of the patient who died by suicide?
So I was the intern on the team. So our teams were made up of just the attending and the intern. So I was kind of the primary or the responding clinician on the team. And it was a patient who I did the admission for, and then it was a short hospital stay that she had been there for. I think it was for about 4 or 5 days. But was the intern that was with her throughout her care.
Got it. And were you involved in discharging the patient as well?
Yes. Right.
So can you describe the incident of the patient's suicide? How did you find out? And
yeah, so I found out, so like I said, I had switched services, and so we were towards the end of the rounds on my second service, and I'd gotten a page with the patient's family information on it, and I don't think that I remembered recognize the name. I was kind of going through my morning, going through my checklist, and I was okay, well, let me just answer this page really quick. So I answered the page, and it was the brother of the patient. And I had left him a voicemail, to try to coordinate care when the patient was being discharged. So this was probably a voicemail that I had left 2 weeks ago. So I didn't even remember what it was. And so he started telling me that he had really appreciated this voicemail that I left him, that I must have heard what had happened. And he really appreciated that I reached out. And so given that I was kind of in the middle of things, it took me a while to kind of figure out what he was talking about. I think I maybe asked a couple of questions just to try to clarify and figure out what was happening. And then I had realized that he was talking about this patient that I had taken care of 2 weeks ago, and that she had committed suicide. And so, like I said, I was in between teams, and so my tending for the day he hadn't left, but we had kind of separated. And the attending on the team that I was on before when I was taking care of this patient was still rounding. So I was kind of here, I got off the phone with the family member, and kind of I remember just kind of standing there not sure what to do with this information. So yeah, that's kind of how I
and did they say how the patient had died?
So it was still unclear at that time. I think it was maybe a day or two after it happened. So it was like, somewhat fresh. And I don't think the patient ever had like an autopsy or anything, but they had found the patient the patient was admitted because they had had significant issues with anxiety and depression in the setting of like pretty bad alcohol use disorder. So they had found her in her room with several bottles and several pill bottles around. And she had been isolating herself like off and on throughout that day. And after like not having any contact, she was living with her brother. And so after not having any contact with her for several hours, I think like they went into her room the next day to check on her, and they found her. Yeah.
So, can you tell me a little about how the aftermath of the event was handled? Like once you were standing there by yourself.
Yeah.
What happened after that?
So I kind of eventually I was able to find the attending who was also on the case, and I told him what happened, and so me and him met for maybe about 30 to 45 minutes that day just to like discuss what had happened. And kind of he was like a fairly new attending, but he had also been in the art department. He had gone to the residency. So he had kind of like let me know about this policy that we had within our department. And typically it's a policy that they try to go over with interns during our orientation week. But the year that I was started training, we weren't able to get to it. So he kind of explained to me that there is this policy and these are the people that I should reach out to let them know about what's going on. And I think he ended up reaching out because it was kind of like this thing had happened. I really didn't know what the policy was. He ended up reaching out on my behalf. So he told our program director, he told the medical director of the service. Yeah. And I think he also told our chief residents. So I think typically those are kind of like the three people that you tell first. And then do you want to keep going?
Yeah.
Okay. Then the medical director came by, I think, later that day. And by this time, it also kind of like I was on service with two other co-interns. So I kind of also told them like what had happened. And then later that day, the medical director came by and met with us. Okay. So there was the three interns and the medical director, and we kind of met and talked about what happened. And then my program director later on that week met with my entire class. So there was like 8 of us. Okay. And we kind of all talked about what happened.
There's going to be people that are coming in and out, but you're okay with that? Because the residents come and get coffee and stuff, so.
Okay.
If you need to just maybe put something on the door.
Okay, thank you. Do you remember what you talked about in those 30, 40 minutes?
We kind of talked about like what happened. Talked about the patient and the course of what happened with the patient, and just kind of like both of our feelings about what had happened, my shock and like processing that this was my first patient suicide, him talking about how he felt and his shock about it, and you know that feeling was normal, and kind of what I should expect going forward. So along with, so we kind of talked about like the process of who I would talk to and kind of how that would be processed within my residency, but like also what would happen as a department as a whole, because we ended up having, I forget what the proper term for it is, but we had like a meeting with risk